So welcome everybody. My name's Julie Willis and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning here at the University of Melbourne. And I'm delighted to welcome you here to the 2024 Symposium, Climate Action in Cities. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the unceded land on which we work, learn and live, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung and Bunurong peoples. I also acknowledge and am grateful to the traditional owners, elders and knowledge holders of all Indigenous nations and clans who have been instrumental in our reconciliation journey. We recognise the unique place held by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the original owners and custodians of the lands and waterways across the Australian continent, with histories of continuous connection dating back more than 60,000 years. We also acknowledge their enduring cultural practices of caring for country. We pay respect to elders past, present and future and acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledges in the Academy. In making this acknowledgement of country, we commit to respectful and responsible conduct towards all others according to the traditional laws of this land, particularly at times of formal ceremony. This symposium is made possible in part through support from the Australian Government's Australian Research Council's Discovery Projects funding scheme. Over 2 days, you're invited to attend our interactive sessions, panel discussions and site visits, which I've heard now are completely sold out. Each session will unpack urban solutions to the climate crisis from different angles, from research to policy to industry, while offering tangible solutions to drive positive sector-wide change. We're delighted to welcome 2 international keynote speakers to this year's symposium. Professor Deb Chatra from Olin College of Engineering in Boston and the Singapore-based founding director of Desire Lines, Sarah Mineko Ichioka. You can hear Deb's keynote lecture, Just, Creative and Cooperative, Our Shared Infrastructural Future, in this theatre straight after this welcome. And I'll leave the discussion of her impressive achievements to Dan Hill, who will introduce her soon. A perfect bookend to the first day of the symposium, Sarah Mineko Ichioka will deliver her keynote, Roots and Roots Towards Right Relation Place in Uncertain Times, in this theatre at 6 o'clock tonight. Her keynote will be followed by drinks and networking, and we look forward to seeing you there. A visiting Tresidder Fellow, Sarah is a strategist, urbanist, author and founding director of Desire Lines, a consultancy for environmental, cultural and social impact organisations and initiatives. She has worked with institutions across the US, Asia and Europe and written for the Financial Times, DZine, Monocle, BBC London and many more. She holds degrees from Yale University and the London School of Economics and Political Science. Throughout the day, you will have the opportunity to hear from local experts and practitioners, including Alison Scotland, Trent McCarthy, Thomas Muleb, Dr. Jonathan Spear and Kelly Grisby, among many others. I note that some of our interactive sessions run concurrently, so do make sure that you are familiar with the program so that you don't miss out on your favourite sessions. I do look forward to hearing all the fascinating discussions to come out from today's sessions. So welcome, and I will now hand you over to Associate Professor Anna Hürlimann.
Thank you, Julie. So good morning, everyone. As Julie mentioned, my name's Anna Hürlimann and I'm really pleased to welcome you here today on behalf of my co-conveners, Sari Musavi, Alan March, Dan Hill, James Halal, I can't see you, and also Judy Bush. So the purpose of this symposium is to advance climate change action in cities and to build networks and collaborations in order to do so. Climate change poses a significant risk to humans and the environment. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, in its latest synthesis report, cities account for up to 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which are the source of climate change. So as such, cities are a really important way in which we can focus our action to address climate change. This is a graph from the recently released, just last month, United Nations Environment program emissions gap report. Now, they publish this each year around November, December. So according to this graph, we can see our current emissions trajectory is just this dark line up the top. So all the international policy agreements around the world are heading to this scenario of warming. This graph shows how far we need to get to in order to bend our emissions to be in line with the Paris Agreement, which is this green line down the bottom. So the international community have agreed to reduce emissions to 1.5 degrees Celsius and not exceed that by 2100. So this is our challenge. How do we bend the trajectory of our emissions down to meet our Paris Agreement goals? So in order to do that, we need to reduce our emissions by 50% by 2030 in order to be on track for zero emissions by 2050 if we have any chance of doing this. So I'm hoping this is okay in terms of resolution, but this graphic is also from the IPCC. It demonstrates the impacts of further warming in addition to 1.5 degrees through different scenarios. And it really makes the case that we should try and do the best we can to limit our emissions in order to limit warming. So every further portion of warming has more significant impacts, as this graph demonstrates, across temperature, in terms of maximum temperature experienced during the day, in terms of extreme drought, precipitation in terms of how much on extreme precipitation events, the diminishing snow cover, and increasing tropical cyclones. There are many more impacts than this one graphic can display, but this is just to demonstrate where we're headed and where we would like to go. So the idea for this symposium really came across from two initiatives, and I'll talk about those two briefly now. So as Julie mentioned, a few of my colleagues and I, Alan March, Georgia Warren-Myers, Sari Musavi and Judy Bush, we've been working on an Australian Research Discovery Grant for the last 5 years. And its topic is integrating climate change adaptation and mitigation in the built environment. We have really a lot of people to thank and acknowledge in terms of their contributions to the project. And we've acknowledged people here on this slide. I want to call out in particular our two postdoctoral associates, Josh Nielsen and also Jeff Brown, and our research assistants across the project, Laura Catroni, Ella Anderson and Fabian Prideaux. We also have had the pleasure of working with 15 industry experts on our expert reference group, and many of whom are here today and will be participating in our panel sessions. So secondly, another initiative was the faculty's Climate Action Interest Group. This started a few years ago, but an idea that David Fedek and I had, and it's grown since. Since Dan Hill came to the faculty, we've really had a great focus on climate change, and since then we now have a built and living environments group that's a focus group of Melbourne climate futures, and so we're a group of researchers conducting research here. And so we thank the members of this group for their contributions to helping us design the program, thinking of guest speakers, and also the participatory workshop sessions as well. So we're going to now share with you a few of our insights from this ARC grant, which are very relevant to the topics of the symposium, and many of you are working in the built environment, so we hope they're of relevance to you. So the research methods over this 5 years included process mapping, interviews with over 150 built environment professionals across urban planning, urban design, architecture, landscape architecture, sustainability experts. I know I've forgotten some, property and construction. We also analysed about 140 policy instruments across the built environment, and also had workshops with our expert reference group. In the first year of the grant, one of the key things that we did was develop this built environment process map. What we identified as lacking in literature and posed in our grant was the absence of thinking holistically about the built environment in terms of understanding its different life stages and the different actors and sectors who were involved and the activities that were undertaken at each life stage. So we mapped this out with help of our expert reference groups and graphically presented. So Sare and Josh in particular, their graphic skills were fantastic in developing this figure. And this was really used as the basis for our inquiry subsequently. Arising from the key findings of all of this research were 6 principles for climate change action in built environments. If we want to achieve transformation in the way that we're addressing climate change in cities, then these 6 principles are needed. So to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees, so in order to mitigate, we need to mitigate emissions and contribute to those Paris Agreement goals. The reality of that graph that I displayed from the UN Environment Report shows that we're probably not going to make that 1.5 degree goal. So we need to ensure that we plan for adaptation beyond 1.5 degrees of warming. We also need to integrate all life stages and thinking, because what our results have found is that if we don't start action early on in life stages, there are missed opportunities then, and we set up things in later life stages that are locked in. We also need collaboration across sectors, coordination between all actors, and also think about justice, making sure that justice is centred in all our decisions made. So again, from all of that research that we conducted, we've identified priorities for climate change action across the built environment. And we've identified these purposefully across different life stages and identified the key actors that can really make a difference at each life stage, but we acknowledge all actors and sectors can make a contribution to each of those actions, but we want to highlight 1 or 2. So I'm not sure if you noticed, but as you walk into this theatre from the inside downstairs, we have a picture of this, this built environment process map with the key actions, and we have next to it some circles, some stickers, and we'd like your feedback on these, and maybe you've got some suggestions for further action at each life stage. We've got different coloured stickers for different sectors as well, if you want to distinguish between the different sectors. So this is an opportunity for you to engage with this aspect of our research if you're interested, and we're interested to hear lots of other ideas and feedback as well. So what we found in speaking to different built environment practitioners, there were 3 sort of key themes emerging, and we'll talk about these through the day. So there was this idea of metabolism, policy, and also capacity. So in terms of metabolism, people found that there was limited consideration of sustainable materials in decision-making, and an idea coming from this is that we need to think about this more thoughtfully and make sure that we're selecting materials to achieve our climate change goals. In terms of policy, across different sectors, the people we spoke to said that policy is a real limitation in terms of not being able to achieve climate change goals. So policy can be a real facilitator for climate action. And then in terms of capacity, there was often mention of a lack of capacity and skills within professionals working in the built environment sector, and people mentioned the need for building capacity across professionals in different sectors. And so these key themes form the key themes for the conference or the symposium today. And you can see them up here. So today we have, as Julie mentioned, 2 fantastic keynote speakers who will touch on climate change in their presentations, Deb Chakra and also Sarah Ichioka. And between those keynote speakers, we have 4 panel sessions, discussion sessions, interspersed with more interactive workshop climate action sessions. So the three panels will touch on each of these topics, and we also have a 4th panel titled Sovereignty, Identity and Climate Change, in conversation with Taylor Broadbent, Michaelia Ridgway and Sarah Beer. And so they'll be talking about Indigenous issues and climate change action. So we hope you enjoy the program today. We hope we all get a lot out of the discussions that we have. There'll be opportunities to ask questions, to discuss throughout the program. I'll just now mention some housekeeping. If you haven't yet got the program downloaded, there's a QR code to do so. And through most of the sessions, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. So we have Slido for questions and answers, and that will help us prioritise the questions that we ask of the speakers. So also please note that today's event is being filmed and photographed. Video and audio captured may be used for promotional purposes, and the lectures will also be available publicly on the internet and the key sessions. So thank you all very much for coming here. We're excited about the discussions and the people we'll get to meet and network with today, and what the future holds in helping address this key issue of climate change. I'd now like to introduce Professor Dan Hill, who's the Director of the Melbourne School of Design, to introduce our first keynote speaker.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks everybody for coming. Welcome. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, the Eastern Kulin Nation. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I'm just going to say a few words to introduce Deb Chatra, who's our opening keynote today. There's a text actually by Amberlynn Quay-Molina, who's a Paliyaku novelist and assistant professor of law at the University of Western Australia. It's from a 2005 edition of the Indigenous Law Bulletin, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. And it's called Seeing the Light, Aboriginal Law, Learning and Sustainable Living in Country. And the excerpt goes a little like this. The pattern that made the whole is in each thread, and all the threads together make the whole. Stand close to the pattern and you can focus on a single thread. Stand a little further back and you can see how the thread connects to others. Stand further back still and you can see it all. And there's only once you see it all that you recognize the pattern of the whole in every individual thread. The whole is more than the sum of its parts, and the whole is in all of its parts. That quote can be read from many angles, of course. As a non-Indigenous person, I'm going to be careful and respectful about trying to read too much into it. But we might hear the distillation of Indigenous cultures, that's intrinsic systemic capability, the idea of reciprocity at numerous scales, of the indivisible nature of country. With my own background in design, technology, and culture, I hear design theory and practice, of course. And I hear Eliel Saarinen and Juhani Palausma in there for the Finns in the room, hardly any. I hear about ideas of assemblage. I hear about inheritance in object-oriented programming. I see the glimmer of a new school of design in the phrasing of Quay-Molina, the threads of learning throughout a curriculum weaving together to form new fabrics patterned with both individual student needs and global matters of concern at the same time. But we might also see parallels in the zooming back and forth between these different scales and cultures and systems in Deb Chatra's work. This sense that our individual touch points, such as interactions with water supplies or power utilities or freeways, are simultaneously part of interconnected and interdependent, super local, municipal, regional, global systems and flows all at the same time. We might hear echoes of all of this in Deb's extraordinary and brilliant book, How Infrastructure Works, Transforming Our Shared Systems for a Changing World. And we're delighted we have Deb here today to share some of her thinking, and no doubt talk through bits of that book as well. Deb Chatra is Professor of Engineering at Olin College of Engineering outside Boston, Massachusetts. She works at the intersection of technology and culture with a focus on infrastructure and the built environment, design, equity and inclusion, and education, particularly engineering. Her writing has appeared in The Atlantic, Time, The Guardian, and many other places, including the comic book Bitch Planet, which I found out last night. I should recommend you all have a look at. Research has been supported by awards from the National Science Foundation, the Sloan Foundation, Autodesk Foundation, and others. And prior to joining Olin, Deb held a postdoctoral research fellowship at MIT and received her undergraduate and graduate degrees in engineering from the University of Toronto. So as that impressive bio implies, Deb's work veers across a broad and rich and varied landscape. In her book, Deb writes, for a large fraction of humanity, the ways we meet our most basic needs, the ways we carry out the most mundane and quotidian activities of our daily lives, and the material culture in which we are embedded are all beyond our capacity to understand or even fully apprehend. And yet she clearly does understand and apprehend this, as you're about to find out. The material science and engineering is balanced by an ability to connect to questions of politics, economics, governance, and therefore deeper, more meaningful questions, again, of culture and shared values and shared identities. It's a rare talent to make a book about infrastructure so interesting, valuable, and thought-provoking. And to my mind, How Infrastructure Works is one of the wisest books about technology that one could read as well. The American sociologist Susan Lee Starr said that good infrastructure is exquisitely boring. And it's in the adverb exquisite that we might latch onto here, perhaps hinting at this other sort of cultural dimension to this otherwise apparently boring thing. And as Deb points out, these systems make manifest our ability to cooperate, to meet universal needs, and to care for each other. So that's what makes them so exquisitely meaningful. In Australia, our infrastructural systems like energy, mobility, perhaps housing, define our reality and our prosperity as much as our everyday life. Sadly, they reveal we have much work to do in terms of care at scale. Recent research by Climate Analytics finds that Australian fossil fuel exports rank second only to Russia for climate damage, with no plan for reduction. In 2024, the Australian government approved the expansion of 3 enormous mines and issued 9 permits for further gas explorations. So this is Australia enabling infrastructural damage at a global scale. In a more everyday sense, utes and SUVs make up the entire top 10 list of car sales in Australia. This is hugely anomalous by any standards. Our transport emissions growth since 2000 has increased by 20%, whereas almost every other equivalent country has decreased it. Even similarly large petro-states have reduced emissions. Canada by about -3%, USA by -9%, Norway by -10%. UK has achieved -25%, Japan -30%, and so on, and Australia is the only one that has increased it. The Australia Institute, describes how, quote, these big dumb cars mean we're spending an extra 13 billion annually, 13 billion Australian dollars to fuel them, at a time when inflation is ushering in dangerous populist governments around the world, as we just saw last week. These are not electric cars either, but almost all the analysis shows that if they were electric, we don't have the materials globally to facilitate such a transition, even with increasing the hugely extractive mining practices that we specialize in. And either way, we hit Jevons paradox along the way there. The incentives that underpin this trend of Australians buying large, inefficient, high-emission vehicles make it virtually impossible, quote, to achieve the Albanese government's 43% emissions reduction target by 2030. Don't worry, today will get cheerier. I'm just laying things out for you. Studies have shown that children involved in a fatal crash are 8 times more likely to have been struck by an SUV than a standard car. In her book, Deb reminds us of the British cybernetician Stafford Beer's memorable quote, "The purpose of a system is what it does." And this statistic alone about children and SUVs should make us wonder what the purpose of Australian infrastructure is at this point. So this is not boring stuff. Infrastructure is fundamental, and fundamental to the way that we imagine the world around us and imagine who we are. In her book, Deb picks apart the difference between private goods like cars and public goods like roads, and unravels their complex symbiotic relationship, laying out what's at stake, but positively, powerfully, and hopefully at the same time. Deb writes that infrastructure is inextricable from culture, woven as it is into our daily life, as well as our history, politics, civic life, and our visions of the future for our families and communities. So perhaps this finally brings us back to the starting points of Quay Molina that I began with. The whole is more than the sum of the parts, and the whole is in all of its parts. And our symposium today, balanced as it is between technical, creative, cultural, and political challenges and possibilities, and fundamentally, so it is fundamentally about how we care for each other and the meaningful places in which we live. I'm so happy that we have Sarah Ichioka, our 2024 Tresida Fellow, to end the proceedings with her closing keynote at the end of the day, as Julie pointed out. And I can think of no better way of starting proceedings than to have Deb as the opening keynote today. So please join me in welcoming Deb Chatra to the stage.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Dan. It's always it's like, I have to live up to my introduction. It's a genuine pleasure to be here today, and I really appreciate the invitation to come. One of the things that I was thinking about when Dan was talking about sort of the transcalar nature of a lot of the work that I do and what I'll be talking about is that it is both global and also sort of hyper locally situated. And so one of the things that I'm always really aware of is that I'm sort of deeply embedded in my specific context, which is I live in the Northeast. I actually spent a lot of time in LA. I'll talk a bit about that. And nothing like getting on a plane and spending 15 hours over the Pacific to be like, you are in a different context now. So, I actually really, when the joys of doing something like this is actually kind of learning about the other contexts. But I kind of want to sort of say in advance that I'm hoping, obviously, that the context that I'm bringing will be from here. But I also I'm very sort of hyper aware that it's like some of the things are going to not fit neatly together because of the sort of hyper-localness of it. So, as Dan said, I'm an engineering professor. And so when people say, oh, you're interested in infrastructure, what kind of infrastructure? Because infrastructure means lots of different things to lots of different people. And I was kind of like, all of it. But specifically what I focused on is what I describe as network technological infrastructure. So this is me in the LA River a few years ago. And some friends of mine and I, we walked the entire 51-mile length, so about a 70 or so kilometer, 80 or so kilometer length of the LA River, which is all channelized, as I'm sure many of you know. We walked the length of it over a long weekend. And so in this photo, you can see power lines, you can see transportation, you can see it's a little bit hard to see because there was a cloudy gray day in LA, which is not what folks think about. So on the left, there are some containers. Of course, I have my phone in my pocket. We were keeping a close eye on the weather, because being in the LA River, which is really a giant stormwater drain, when it's raining, can be a little bit iffy. It all worked out. So I'm really, as I said, I'm an engineering professor. I'm really kind of focused on these technological systems. And so I love Ursula K. Le Guin's definition of technology. And she says, technology is how a society copes with physical reality, right? How people get and keep and cook food, how they clothe themselves, what their power sources are, what they build with and what they build, their medicine, and so on and on. And I'm sure you can see in that list both, people who are concerned with the built environment, and you can see infrastructural systems sort of starting to rise there. And she wrote, technology is the active human interface with the material world, right? It's not just kind of the high-tech thing, it's not just the data centers, it literally is everything we do to interface with this material world. So for our purposes and the things I focus on, I really, my focus has been on these networks, and to include things like water. This is a reservoir in Sweden. Includes things like the mirror image of water, which is sewage. This is my local sewage treatment plant. You can see from the front that I took the photo. I took the photo taking off from Boston Logan. This is our local sewage treatment plant. It includes transportation and mobility. The newest of these infrastructural networks is telecommunications, particularly global telecommunications, and of course, things like electricity. So I'm actually going to take a few minutes, actually, just to talk about how these fit together before I go any further. So this is the reservoir, the oldest reservoir. It's actually called the New Croton Dam Reservoir for New York City. So this is up the Hudson River. And it was built because in the 19th century, people who were living in New York City, and particularly in Manhattan, were like, well, there are a lot of people living close together, and everybody needs water every day, right? Because we're humans. And if you have a whole bunch of, and so getting clean water every day is an issue. And when you have a lot of humans living close together, getting clean, particularly clean water every day becomes an increasing issue, right? That's why cholera, until fairly recently, was sort of endemic in cities. And still, there are resurgences of cholera in places where local sanitation is damaged in some way. So the argument here was, look, if we all get together and we put this big sort of investment in and build out a water system, then we will all benefit from it, right? But that takes a few things for that to happen. So one is, it's a thing that everyone needs every day, and it's a thing where you benefit from the people around you also having access to clean water, right? Because it means that your family is less likely to get sick if the people around you are less likely are not getting sick, right? So the public good piece is already starting to manifest here. From an energy point of view, water flows downhill, which seems really obvious. Water can also be divided and subdivided into networks, right? So the idea was that if you build a reservoir and you build aqueducts, you have to put a huge amount of work in to build it in the first place. This is, what you see on the screen is a tiny part of the sort of dam that's in this reservoir, much less the aqueduct. But once it's built, you pretty much open the valve and the water more or less delivers itself. And like to this day, 96, 97% of New York City water is delivered by gravity alone, right? So it doesn't require any energy to keep it going. And so they did, right? They built this. And the logic of this, that everyone needs it, that you can make this investment, that once you do, everyone will benefit from it, is so clear that there's a reason why I think of water as kind of the infrastructure, right? It's that in, as settlements, human settlements have come together, they've kind of pretty much have figured out how are we going to get water for everyone, right? It's that sort of, the logic of it is clear. The fact that water flows downhill, so you don't need extra energy to make it work, is why it's a thing we've had for, thousands of years now, as opposed to the other systems I mentioned that are relatively newer. But there's also, in order for this to happen, there's a few pieces to it, right? One is it means that you are expected to be in a sustained relationship with the people around you because you're making this big upfront investment that you're all going to benefit from, right? That's one thing. Two, it has something to do with the fact that it's really about where you are in the landscape, right? Where your body is and the people around you. And so it basically brings you into a relationship with those people around you and the landscape that you're embedded within. So there's that relationship comes from it. And so it really is like these sort of things, if we sort of step away from it and we sort of think about them, they really are about having long-term relationships with the people around us, but also having a long-term relationship with the network in which the landscape in which this network is embedded. So I think I'm going to pause there because I'm going to move on. So I really love this quote by Amartya Sen. He was a developmental economist, and he studied some of the poorest communities in the world. And he said, we generally have excellent reasons for wanting more income or wealth, he says. It's not because they're desirable for their own sake. And in fact, I'm going to pause and editorialize. We pretty much think it's pathological, right? When people are interested in like money or income for its own sake. But we want them to the extent that they're an admirable general purpose means for having more freedom to live the kind of lives that we have reason to value. The usefulness of wealth lies in the things that it allows us to do, the substantive freedoms it helps us achieve. And Amartya Sen, the book that he's most famous for is called Development is Freedom, right? So he makes this argument that the reason why we want money is because it gives us agency in the world. It lets us do what we want to do. So my favorite example of this is one of those things that's like so completely obvious that it's easy to overlook, which is that in almost every sort of human society, every community, as soon as people have resources that go beyond meeting their basic survival needs, right, things you need every day, like water and food, it is immediately spent on light, on artificial light. And in fact, it's actually so close a relationship that you can use aerial photographs of communities as a proxy for the development of that region, right? That it will get brighter as people have more money to spend, because the thing you do is you buy, light is almost pure agency, right? It's the thing that lets you be in a room like this that has no windows, right? The thing that lets you do what you want to do after the sun goes down or before it comes up in the morning, right? So that freedom to act in the world, like, yes, it comes from money, but in practice, it actually comes from having access to the energy in the form of artificial light. And so, Sen says the purpose of income and wealth is to give us freedom in the world. And I submit that for many of us, and certainly for anyone who is in this room, our freedom to act in the world, our ability to do what we want to do, comes more from these collective networks, these infrastructural systems, than it does from like what is in our own personal bank account. And so I grew up as you might have gone from Dan saying I went to the University of Toronto, I grew up just outside Toronto in Canada, although I've lived in the US now for about 2 decades. And I often joke that so I grew up, so Toronto's right around here, and I actually grew up, I was born very close to a nuclear reactor, the Pickering nuclear power plant, and I sort of say that my energy birthright was that nuclear power station and Niagara Falls, the hydroelectricity from Niagara Falls, but I grew up sort of in this full stack of clean water and sewage and transportation, and when it began to come, like, telecommunications in the form of phone and radio, and then when the internet and mobile telephony came online, that was all part of the world that I was in. So I want to talk, actually, this is Niagara Falls, and in fact, this over here, so this is the Niagara River. So in the foreground is the New York Power Authority plant, and because I was standing in that when I took this photo, and then on the right is Ontario. So this is one of the power plants that powered Toronto, where I grew up. So it's part of that infrastructure birthright, access to this energy that was used for that powers these collective infrastructural systems. So electricity is obviously one of them, right? And so the idea that I was living in Toronto, but my electricity was coming from around Lake Ontario, from pretty far away, I'm going to use that as sort of an example of actually talking about what I think is a really important point when we think about these networks. So all of the networks that I've just described, if you're in sort of the city or in the metropole, they are bringing resources from wherever, from up the Hudson, from Niagara Falls. So it's electrons from Niagara Falls, it's water from up the Hudson, telecommunications from everywhere, right? It's bringing everything to where you are, to where you live. And it's actually one of the reasons why cities have been so closely tied to infrastructure, right? Because they're sort of part of these networks. But the flip side of any network that can bring resources to where you are is that it's also really good at extracting resources from other places, right? So getting from somewhere, and that's when we think about things like materials flows, and I will talk much more about this in a few minutes. But the other thing that they can do is that they're really good at displacing the harms, right? So this group is going to benefit and the harms are going to be put somewhere else. And I'm going to talk about this specifically, and the reason why I want to talk about this is because I want to make a specific point. So this is an aerial view of those two power plants from Google Maps. And so this is the Canadian one, it's kind of right here, and there's a reservoir behind it. This is the American one, and then there's this large reservoir right behind it. And what you can see on the other side is that this is Tuscarora Nation Indian Territory. So this is First Nations and Indigenous peoples in the United States. So Robert Moses, whose name I'm sure is familiar to a number of you, who this power plant is named after, when he was building this power station, he went to the Supreme Court to ask the US to break the treaty obligation to the Tuscarora peoples to be able to take this land for the reservoir. And there was at least one dissenting voice on that, but it passed. And I don't think Moses had any doubt when it passed. And I haven't gone deeply into the timing, but I'm pretty sure that he started building it before the judgment came down, right? Knowing which way it was going to come. And the reason why I want to bring this up is because the argument that I'm sure Moses made was an essentially utilitarian argument, right? There's like a very small number of people who live here. There are 10 million, or whatever the population of New York City was at the time. It is important that they have reliable access to electricity. And to be fair, if you live anywhere here, and as I said, I lived in Toronto, you also have access to reliable energy, right? So electricity in the form of hydroelectricity. And that includes the people who lived in this area, right? And the difference is that I'm very engineering, right? There's a distribution of benefits over people, right? It's like who's benefiting from this? And there's a distribution of harms, right? The harms are not evenly distributed. And the thing I kind of want to get across here is that this isn't this group benefits and this group is harmed. There's enough of that, right? But the more general case is that there is a distribution of benefits, right? So, and then there's a different distribution of harms. So that there might be people who benefit who are also harmed. There might be people who get greater or lesser degrees. And once you sort of see this framing, it turns out to be a really useful framing because it gets away from the adversarial, this versus that, and gets more into there's a set of harms. How are we going to make decisions about who sees them? And so if you think about things like, in the US, the question of where highways went in cities, right? And it's like who benefits from the highways versus who's dealing with the harms of noise, pollution, and the like, right? Sometimes they're the same people, often they're not the same people, but it sort of sidesteps you also benefit from blah, blah, blah. It's like, yes, but there's disproportionate harms. So that's one of the things I kind of want to highlight to start with. So in the 20th century then, one of the big stories of the 20th century is the growth of all of these networks in sort of size, like how big they are. This is the Hoover Dam. In geographical extent, right? How big these networks are, how far they are, and then new kinds of technology. So this is civil aviation, and then things like containerization, right? So moving goods around. And containerization dropped the cost of goods so far that essentially means that the cost of transportation is a negligible cost of the cost of making things. And this really, when we talk about globalization, these are the things, the sort of global movement of atoms, of people, and of information is really what we mean. And more than any, I think, with this one, it's containerization, right? So it's like, if you think about living in a global world, it's because, you know, all the stuff about like stuff getting shipped all over and like moved all over, right? It has everything to do with the fact that the cost of shipping things around the world is now incredibly small compared to the cost, right? That kind of changed everything. And so I grew up in Canada, as I said, so it's like things like the North American Free Trade Act, right? They followed this change in infrastructure, where it's like, well, now it's like easy and cheap to move things around, so we want to be able to do more of that, and the Free Trade Acts followed from that. So that's kind of the economic point of view, but like I'm an engineer and I think about matter and energy. And a piece of this is that you know, we measure it in dollars, right? But energy is the actual currency of the material world, right? Everything we do in the world requires energy. Our agency in the world, so things like light, depend on access to energy. So as these systems get bigger and they grow, right, there are consequences that we are familiar with. So one of them is this graph of how much energy was used. So it's basically, you know, a flat line for most of human history until 1800, right? And then this is the exponential growth that was powered by fossil fuels. So you can see on this graph, you can see coal, oil, gas, and then these smaller things coming in. But the key point here is that it's this sort of exponential, this sort of increase. And a huge chunk of that is powering these systems, right? So when we talk about the infrastructural networks that we're embedded in, right, it's the energy usage. So we get agency because we have access to this energy to do things, but also, right, it's not just an economic thing, it's this sort of, that energy, it's a sort of growing thing. So this is not as, you know, it might, at first glance, you might be, oh, this is a graph of GDP per capita, but actually it's a graph of energy usage per capita, and it ties in really nicely with what Dan said, that you can see the darker the color, the more our individual energy footprint is. And, you know, Canada's up here, and I often say it's like, it's, you know, it has about the same standard of living as the US, but it's bigger and colder, right? So it uses more energy. You can see Australia right here, also pretty dark red, right? That, because, you know, when we talk about living in different places, really what we think about is like, what it means to like go to a different place is like the infrastructure systems that you're embedded in, right? And so it's this collective use of energy rather than the sort of individual use of energy. And so like coming here, I had to make sure I had like the right adapters for the electrical system, right? It's like what it means when you say you go to different places. And, you know, my parents emigrated from India to Canada, right? So like one of the big differences between that and when I went home as a kid to where my parents lived is this idea that in Canada, I'm embedded in these infrastructural systems, right? This infrastructural birthright, and there's a very different set of them that were available to us in India. And you see that reflected in this per capita energy usage, right, by these pale colors. I also actually kind of want to highlight this, right? So in 1800, about 10% of the population was urban, and I wrote kind of 50 to 80% urban at the present. It kind of depends how and where you're counting. So it's about 80% in the global north. So in highly economically developed countries, about 80% of the population lives in cities. 2007 is where people agree that half the world's population, half went over cities. The question of like, what is a city, as I'm sure many of you know, is contested, right? So you can say, well, who lives, for our purposes, I'm thinking about infrastructure. If you live in a town, right, if you live in a reasonably dense area, so there's some numbers that is in fact close to 80%, right? Do you have, and from my point of view, one way of thinking about it is that do you have shared infrastructure with the people around you? But regardless, you can sort of see how this sort of, these networks and this energy usage has been powering urbanization. You know, I heard Roger Kyle, who's a professor at York University in Toronto, and he said, there's really nothing, there's no outside anymore, right? In terms of outside the cities, right? There's no, it's impossible to sort of exist anywhere on our planet and not understand where you are with respect to cities. And so there's no kind of like rural that is independent of the cities. The rural, there's an understanding that the center is the cities, they're the metropole versus the hinterland. And this is fundamentally why, right? Because these networks are now global, and no matter where you live, you are part of these networks. So I said, use the idea of distributing harms. And of course, one of the other consequences of this is not just displacing them, like putting them into a discrete place, right? But all of the fossil fuel emissions, you can think of putting CO2 in the atmosphere as accomplishing kind of the same thing, which is that there are groups of folks that benefit, but those CO2 molecules go everywhere in the world, and therefore you're diffusing the harms. And to the extent that we're here today talking about climate action, right, we recognize that we ourselves, we benefited and now we're also dealing with the harms. But of course, there are many people in the world who the harms are being diffused out to them, being displaced out to them, who have not received the benefits. And actually, the one, I'm going to say, pop back 2 graphs. The other thing, of course, is that I feel like this doesn't kind of get said enough. This is cumulative, right? There's a rate of increase, but then there's also the total amount of CO2 that's in the atmosphere. So that's kind of the world we're living in, right? That's why it's accumulating, not just how quickly it's going up, it's why it's going to take so long for sea level rise, right? Because there's the CO2 that's already accumulated in the atmosphere. And of course, the other thing we know with cities, and I grabbed this photo from Teen Vogue because I feel like Teen Vogue is underappreciated how good their sort of political point of view is. But you can pretty much substitute Australia here. A few trips ago, I was in Sydney, and I went hiking outside the city. I want to say the Seven Sisters, and about a couple of years later, I got emails within very close succession from friends of mine in Oregon, where I'd gone hiking, and in Australia to say, oh, the place we went hiking, it's been burned out and it doesn't exist anymore. On the opposite side of the Pacific, basically. But the point I want to make is actually that specifically that all of these networks, right, that are embedded in the landscape that move things around the landscape, if that landscape is no longer stable, right, then no matter how good a job you did, it's not going to function as intended anymore. Right? And in fact, often the way we think about climate change, the way it manifests is that our infrastructural systems are affected, right? So California, it's like, did your power get cut off or did the power systems go down? It's, are roads passable? Hurricane Sandy took out the New York subway system. So the way we think about the impact of climate change, and particularly in the form of natural disasters, is the impact it has on our infrastructural systems, right? And it's impossible, no matter how well designed your infrastructure is, it presupposes this stable landscape, and these landscapes are no longer stable. So Dan also mentioned Saarinen, and how many people in this room know this quote? Right? So always design a thing by considering it in its larger context: a chair in a room in a house in an environment in a city plan. I think that I have convinced you that the larger context of cities is in fact these networks, right? And these networks basically extend pretty far out. So here's the larger context. So this is the million, I stand back here so the mic works. This is the literally the million mile view. So this is an image of the Earth that was taken at Lagrange point 1, which is the point in space that you can set an object between the Earth and the sun, and it holds its position. And there is in fact a human-made object there, which is an Earth observatory. That faces our planet and literally is an observatory. So you can see the Earth rotates in front of it. You can actually, if you look, you can see the sun in that image. And this is the actual reality of our planet. When people talk about planetary boundaries, this is what they're talking about. So our Earth is drenched, absolutely drenched in sunlight, right? So if every human used energy at the rate of us energy-hungry Canadians, it still would only be a fraction of a percent of the incoming energy, right? So it's like the Earth is not short of energy in the largest sense. We just haven't been very good at accessing it. But the other thing you see from this image is that the Earth is surrounded by the void of space, right? Like basically barring like the odd meteorite, the odd spacecraft, nothing really comes in or out. It is a closed system. And again, coming back to I'm an engineer, it's like, okay, well, from an energy point of view, right? There is an infinite amount of energy. It is constantly renewing. From the point of view of actual physical atoms, right? Actual matter, it is A, a closed system, and B, we are hitting the limits of this, right? This is what it means when we say the CO2 in the atmosphere is increasing. It means that we cannot, it's like it's a box, right? It's like we are increasing the concentration. We're taking these atoms out of the ground. We're transforming them, right? We take the fossil fuels out, you burn them, you take the energy out in the process of burning it, you transform it to something else, but those actual atoms still have to go somewhere, right? Except that now instead of being in the ground, they're in the air. And this is why things like carbon capture and how long it works for become an issue. So that's where we are. And so the other piece of this, and this is the thing that's happened over the last 20 or so years, is that for the first time in basically human history, we have figured out how to get energy without passing through combustion, right? How to get energy at scale without going through transforming, like digging out atoms, transforming them into something else, right? And dumping those atoms, right? The thing about, so these are the Danish design for wind turbines. This is actually Palm Springs, or outside Palm Springs. And these are solar panels. This photo is taken outside of Hyderabad. Due to basically an enormous investment and sort of policy, right? We've figured out how to get energy basically without setting things on fire. And what we're now working through, so we've kind of done, if we need energy as agency, right? And energy is the thing that lets us do what we want. And we've now more or less figured out the technological problem of like, how do we access that energy without going through fossil fuels? And this is actually like, just gonna pause and be like, however terrible climate change seems, this is actually kind of amazing, right? Like we have what we need to build this world, right? It is unthinkably hard to do, but it does not violate the law of conservation of energy hard, right? Which is, genuinely impossible. So now we're figuring out how to do it, not is it possible. It was not possible a quarter century ago, which is like not even eye blink, right, in human history. And I think we haven't fully wrapped our brain around what this means, right? And so that's what I'm going to talk about. So the first thing I want to talk about is further to sort of Anna's point around justice, right? Is that as we build out this technological transformation, is to think about what are we doing with the harms, right? How are we mitigating the harms or distributing them? And I imagine, again, many of you recognize this photo or like recognize what this is. My face was like, of course, stuck to the window as I was landing because I landed in over these solar farms, and then realized that Melbourne Airport has basically moved hard into sort of in-house, like basically doing its own electricity. And it was so obvious that like these giant fields there's already harms that have been distributed to them, right? Which is that they are freaking loud because there are jet planes landing on them. And it was such a beautiful example of, okay, if you're going to do this thing, how do you mitigate the harms or how do you avoid displacing the harms? And the answer is, in this case, use the area where, basically use this land that they already have that has already been sort of set aside, as opposed to putting them someplace else, as opposed to building a coal plant somewhere else and bringing the energy in, right? So this is the kind of thing when we think about justice, per Anna's point, when we think about not doing what we did with the previous version, right, of our infrastructure. We built out this infrastructure and we kind of really just focused on put the harm somewhere else, right? And now it's like, oh no, actually, let's figure out how we manage the harms ourselves so we don't displace them elsewhere. This is downtown Los Angeles. This is 1951. There are sort of many sort of stories about how highways were built in urban American cities that were, again, I would describe it there as a slider between, on the one hand, engineers saying, well, these poor African-American neighborhoods are the least, the poorest quality housing, the least valuable, the least valuable, so we can pay to take them away versus on one hand, and so for design would put the highway, you can say, we're going to put it through this African-American neighborhood. There's kind of a technocratic utilitarianist argument on one hand. At the other side, there's certainly evidence that it was straight up racial animosity in other cities, right? There's a slider. But we recognize that we do not want to do this again, right? This idea of like, we're just going to distribute these harms, and that a small group of us can make the decisions about where those harms are going to go really doesn't fly. And I said that the one story of the 20th century was growing out these infrastructural systems. Of course, another big story of the 20th century was the decentralization of political power, right? So in this photo was taken in 1951, it was before the civil rights movement in the United States, for example, right? It was before women had sort of full access to the workforce, right? These decisions were being made by a small group of people. And so where we are now is figuring out kind of alternate ways how to do this. And I know that many people in this room are engaged in that question. I think that's happening in many ways in many different places. I'm going to share this one because it's this comes out of a design group called Spherical that are based in San Francisco in the Bay Area. And this actually, I bet to say it just went live. It's not quite live. This is incredibly new. So they are working on a field kit, a toolkit to help people in LA understand the infrastructure, particularly around stormwater, to sort of sketch out possibilities for what can be done in the neighborhood in terms of water management. And then they've basically created this kit, and you can see primers, layers, stories, sketches, proposals, because the idea is to help communities make decisions, make proposals about basically what can be done in the areas they're interested in, like their school or their block, that involve stormwater management, so that they can actually work with urban planners, put a proposal in, and get LA County funding for those changes. And so the reason why I'm sharing this, and there's a link to it, I actually thought it went live in October. I just spoke to one of the principals of Spherical this morning. I think the public beta is going live tomorrow. And it's very explicitly intended to be in the comments, right? It's very intended to be a thing that is available for everyone to use, because we're figuring out this question of how do we incorporate justice? How do we let people have a voice, right, to do this work? And it will necessarily be done at the sort of city level, right? There's no more building Hoover dams in the desert, right? The questions are going to be what's going to be happening in our local environments in these situated ways. So I'll point you to that. And then the other thing, I said the two realities of this. One is the question of energy and what we can do when we have access to energy. One important thing we can do is actually use it to mitigate harms rather than just displacing them, right? Making the decisions to do things as we do these new things, but also using the energy to mitigate those harms. So this is from the Rural Electrification Administration. So this is in the 1930s when the US actually built out federal electricity everywhere. It's actually an incredible and underappreciated story, I think. But I love this, right? Working together did it, all the power you want, a lowest cost, a dream come true. And that kind of is the world that we are about to live in, right? And if we have access to renewable energy, it changes everything really about energy, right? It makes it decentralized. I think of it, energy itself, like in the world, is a decentralized, distributed public good. Right? It is everywhere. No matter where you live, you have access to it. The sun shines everywhere, or the wind blows, or there's waves, or there's geothermal, right? It is decentralized versus fossil fuels, which is you have a hole in the ground, you put a fence around it, you pull out an infinite amount of energy, right? And historically what that means is you defend that spot on the ground. And that's where the geopolitics around fossil fuels come from. So if we treat energy as a public good, if we treat it as what it is, a sort of inexpensive, widely available thing, it can really change how we do things, but only if we think about what we're doing and how. Because here's the thing. The last time we got access to large amounts, the sort of big increase in the amount of energy we have, this is what we did. So this is an aluminum smelter. So aluminum in the 19th century was a precious metal, like an actual, like lighter than silver, beautiful silvery metal. There was like baby rattles made for one of the Napoleon's, like the Napoleon III's prince's son out of aluminum, which seems insane to us now, because there was the beautiful light thing. It's perfect for a baby rattle, right? And in the late 19th century, Hall and Héroult figured out how to get aluminum out of, basically how to extract it from its ore, right? They figured out the actual process to use. And so the first thing you need to do, so aluminum is not precious in the sense of there's not very much of it in the world. Aluminum is among the top few most abundant elements in the Earth's crust. The problem is that almost all of it is bound extremely tightly to oxygen. And this is where, Dan mentioned that my background is material science, right? And here is it showing, right? It's aluminum oxide, it's very, very tightly bound. So you need, if you want to separate it into a metal, you need two things. One of them is you need to know how to do it. And that's kind of what Hall and Héroult figured out. And Hall in particular, it was like the foundation for Alcoa, the big American aluminum company. The second thing you need is you need a huge amount of electricity. Right? You need a huge amount of energy, and particularly you need in the form of electricity. So what made that possible was access to inexpensive hydroelectricity initially. And in the US, that was the Hoover Dam, the stuff that was built out during the New Deal, and then World War II happened, and it was like, oh, hey, aluminum is excellent for making planes. We have these hydroelectricity generation. we're going to build our aluminum capacity so we can build and make lots and lots of aluminum. And so when we got access to both how do you do it and the energy you need to do it, the thing that we did was basically this, right? The idea that, well, we can just supercharge extraction, and so getting it from far away, all the stuff I said about containers and moving it around, right? So the energy required to extract it and the harms that are associated there, moving it around, refining it, which takes a huge amount of energy, fabricating it into whatever you want, and then distributing that, and then pretty much just kind of junking it at the end. And actually, aluminum is actually recycled pretty well. I don't know what the state of it is here in Australia, but because it takes so much energy to refine aluminum in the first place. Remember I said energy is the actual currency of the material world, right? It's economically viable to recycle aluminum because it takes so much energy, right, that it actually takes less energy to recycle it than to get it in the first place. So aluminum tends to get recycled. More, like not as much as it should, but certainly more than I think. Steel's the same way, glass is the same way. You know what does not get recycled? So part of it is because the thing about plastics is that there are so many kinds of plastics. There's mostly no easy way to recycle them. But also, if you burn plastic, you get energy, right? And in fact, I was in Sweden recently, and they use bioincineration, or they use incineration. So it's like, we're going to burn our plastic and use it to produce heat and energy because it does. So that means that if you want to do anything other than that, you need to put energy into it, right? And this is like physical reality of the world, right? It's like if you want to turn plastic into other plastic, you pretty much need to break it down to its raw components, like carbon dioxide, and then turn it into something new. So this is a company called 12.co, and the URL is 12.co. And the thing that they are doing is that they are taking, actually, let me back up a step. So the person who's highlighted here is Atasha Cave. And again, much like Spherical, this is not like this is the answer, but I'm particularly proud of this one because she was in the very first engineering class I taught at Olin College. And so she graduated, and eventually she did her PhD at Stanford and looked at a catalyst to turn CO2 and water in the air, put in a huge amount of energy and turn it back into long chain. So turn it back into biofuels or into fuels, turn it back into things like polymers. That takes an enormous amount of energy, but if that energy is coming from renewable sources, it kind of doesn't matter that it takes a huge amount of energy. And so they are currently building pilot plants in the US. And so this is the kind of thing that is possible now in a way that it hasn't been before, right? To close materials loops by putting in a large amount of energy, which we haven't had access to before, to basically reuse materials in a way we've never done before, right? So instead of saying we're going to extract, instead of supercharging the extract, use, dump, right, which is what we did the last time we got access to energy, this next big jump in energy means that we have the possibility of figuring out how to actually close those loops, right? The main reason why we don't close those loops is because it costs too much money, which means, say after me, it takes too much energy, right? But if we have access to the energy, then that opens up this new set of possibilities. But that is not a given, right? There is no guarantee that that will happen, right? This is the piece where it's like, this is really, like I feel like the energy piece is a little bit of a foregone thing because the value, economic value of having distributed renewable energies is pretty clear. Really thinking hard about the metabolism, thinking about the material flows is not as much of a foregone conclusion. It is definitely the one where we kind of have to decide, this is the thing we want to do. But at the same time, it's like, we can imagine living in a world, the things that immediately come to mind are like, okay, well, what if you lived in a place where we don't desalinate water for the same reason, right? We'll never not take a huge amount of energy to pull salt out of water, right? Because it wants to be there, it dissolves really easily. That's why our seas are salty. But if it's like, okay, well, we're gonna build a giant desalination plant that is on our coast and we're gonna power it using solar or other renewable energy, and everyone who lives in our city is gonna be guaranteed a household's worth of clean, potable water instead of bringing it from someplace far away, right? It's like, that's starting to get in the realm of things that we think are not actually possible, but could be now, right? And so thinking through the possibilities that we can have if we treat renewable energy like the public good that it is, if we sort of wrap our head around the idea that for the first time in human history, we are living in a different world, but if that is informed by, as Anna said early on, the idea of justice. And I actually just realized that all of this is, she showed this curve, there's this sort of ring, and there's like, it went to the far right, and there's the purple bit, right? And it said like reuse of materials, right? This is kind of where we are. This is the piece, right? There's the energy piece, but now we're putting it all together to be like, okay, well, what are you making this world out of? And what are you doing with those materials? And what does that mean? So one of the ways in which I think about this is, this is literally a building in New York City, is like new story building, right? Is this idea that, okay, we have the technology for the first time in human history, we know what we want to do, we have built these systems that do an incredibly good job of taking care of us, but they also embody a set of values. They're the sort of physical manifestation of a set of values. And some of the values we don't agree with anymore, right? These systems were built 100 years ago. They constrain and afford the decisions we make today. We're like, yeah, we're not super thrilled about that set of decisions. So we, totally makes sense for us to be like, okay, we can rebuild them. We have the technologies broadly that we need for this technological transformation. But a chunk of it is going to be like basically wrapping our head around what are we trying to do and why. And I know that is the bulk of today and what that means for people who are working in the built environment in the city. So I just wanted to give you this kind of framing for it, right? All cities are embedded in this network. The larger context for cities is now, in fact, the world, right? Our infrastructural systems shape what we can do. We have the opportunity to transform them because of energy in a way we've never had it before. But in order to do that, we kind of really need to wrap our head around these new affordances, these new possibilities, these new stories that we're making. And I have to say, I loved seeing Anna's slide with justice right in the center because I feel like I'm coming at it from exactly the same spot. So Ursula Franklin was a professor emerita of material science at my alma mater. She gave a series of lectures on the Canadian CBC, which is like the ABC, but for Canada. The Matthew Lectures in 1989 called The Real World of Technology. And she said this, that central to any new order that can shape and direct technology and human destiny, and that is like really what we're talking about here, right? Will be a renewed emphasis on the concept of justice. So I love that we are all in agreement here. Thank you so much. I think we have a bit of time for questions.
Thank you, Deb. That was amazing. We've got about 5 minutes for questions. Encourage people to, is that the Slido thing? So use this bit of infrastructure to ask questions about infrastructure if you want to. And if not, I'll look at some hands in the room in a second. But just to say thank you for that. And thank you particularly, given that you landed last night from across the world about 28 hours ago. It was it's kind of amazing to see the energy as well as the insight that you bring to the topic. I've written down so many things here. Particularly energy is the actual currency of the material world, which I think is probably worth a t-shirt, at least a biodegradable t-shirt of some kind. But even your understanding, just the way that you casually show your material, in a sense, that salt wants to be in the seawater, just like lovely asides like that as well. So thank you so much. I think it's so interesting to get this sense of this kind of, I think what Sarah might talk about later, not to put you on the spot, but maybe this kind of possibilist framework, at least, around the way that we see the world in terms of this abundance of energy, which we're on the verge of being able to unleash, and how do we do that with justice? But then this balancing act of, but then there's hard material limits, given that lovely blue marble in space that you showed us. Anyway, so any questions in the room, just put your hand up and then we'll get a mic towards you, or any reactions is fine. There's some people here, and I'll check Slido at the same time.
And actually, while you do that, I'm actually going to say, Sarah, I'm super looking forward to your talk, so Sarah's talk at the end of today, because it's sort of there's so many different pathways to sort of wrap our head around how do we think about materials, and the regenerative piece is absolutely one of them. And so this is not particularly given the timeline we're working on, right, is trying to think about sort of a manifold pathways forward rather than just any kind of one given answer. So I feel like I'm sort of in the expanding set of possibilities, and one of the reasons why I'm really happy to be here is to get into the weeds of like, okay, well, how do we do this, and what can we do today versus what's being done in labs in places like Stanford.
Yeah, great. So we've got a question at the back. Just say who you are and
Yeah, I'm Hans Baer, a ecological anthropologist based here at the University of Melbourne. Deb, the question I have is how much energy do we really need? Now, in a capitalist world, we need a shitload of energy. And in that kind of system, some individuals like Elon Musk and Donald Trump have access to incredible amounts of energy. On the other hand, other people lack energy and are losing energy. And here I point to the victims of the genocide in Gaza. That doesn't get mentioned very much. So how do we achieve energy justice, which was one of your last slides?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I saw your hand go straight up. In fact, actually, almost the first thing that Israel did after October 6th was shut down the electricity to Gaza. And that was pretty much the first thing I saw in response to it. And it does a really good job of illustrating the relationship between having access to energy and having agency to act, right? There's a reason why it was shut down. And in fact, it is a violation of the Geneva Convention broadly to do that. It's Gaza. It's at the other end of things that don't get mentioned much. My parents were born in what is now Pakistan, what was then India, and I'm really aware that most people on the planet who look like me, basically middle-aged brown women, most of their day is actually spent getting fuel for cooking because there's no human culture that doesn't eat cooked food, and doing things like getting clean water. And so when I think about energy justice, I think about both those sides, right? Both the way that energy can be, centralization of energy, control of energy can be used as a political tool, but also in the way that having access to energy and having the agency that comes from having access to energy is so unevenly distributed on the planet. So I think it's less a question of we are looking at taking energy away from some people and giving it to other people, although I think that it's really, really hard to justify private jets. And so Taylor Swift falls into that category too. But because there's a few things that really kind of blow out the ceiling of how much energy people use. Broadly, if you look at energy usage in developing countries, it is mostly flatlined, right? And it turns out that there's only so much energy that if you're not getting a private jet, that we use sort of as a society, where the real thing is actually making energy available to people who've never had access to it. And so I feel like that piece of the justice is where I'm particularly interested in things like renewable energy because of the way that they are distributed, they're decentralized, they're located kind of where they are. And what it means is basically, you're sort of talking about, can we lower the ceiling? And I think there's definitely places where I think that makes sense to do. But the other side is, can we raise the floor, right? And I think there is a huge amount of space on the raising the floor front. And there are many, many more people who are affected by can we raise the floor? And we're already seeing this happen, right? If you look at the uptake of solar, like a lot of the global south is like leapfrogged landlines to go straight to mobile phones. They're now leapfrogging fossil fuels to go straight to distributed renewables, right? So we're starting to see this happen. I personally would be not unhappy with regulation around things like private jets. Where I live, there's a Hanscom Field. They're trying to expand it, but it's used for, among other things, private jets. So there's a huge citizen push to not let that happen, to not basically allow private jets to land there for largely this reason. So I feel like these pieces are all sort of interlinked. But there's like a floor, there's a ceiling, there's justice, there's who has control over it. And part of, to me, the great power of renewables is how it changes the distribution, it makes it the sort of the redistribution of energy possible in new ways.
We're going to have to leave it there because I'm getting the furious wind-up signals from the people making the morning tea outside, and that's another kind of infrastructure we need to honor and obey. So I hope you'll forgive me for curtailing the questions. I did have an option of trying to stop Deb, sort of 10 minutes before the end of her speech, going like that, but she was going so beautifully, I thought, let's just let her cook and keep going to the end. So we gave her more time, which means we have less time for questions, but please capture the tea up there, head outside, you'll see morning tea. I think we have 15 minutes for that. And then come back on with the day. But please join me in thanking Deb Chatra for an amazing start to the.
Thank you.